Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about indirect causes of corruption. And the first one, of course, is what we call the quality of the bureaucracy itself. In other words, are the regulations transparent so that anybody can understand them and apply their own understanding to particular circumstances? In other words, does it give some sort of a more egalitarian approach to distributing power between the civil servant and the lay person outside the government? So can, for example, a government official say, well, you didn't understand it because it's this way, and they say, well, no, I read the regulation, this is what it said, and therefore I have certain protections, and therefore I don't need to be shaken down by a corrupt official. Is it that kind of a relationships which would reduce corruption, or is it, again, one of those things where the average person cannot interpret a regulation, and therefore that gives a civil servant a tremendous degree of power? And of course, some bureaucracies are just going to be less efficient than others. It takes longer to process paperwork. And in those cases, people may have incentives to try to bribe a public official, or a public official may have an incentive or may have some degree of leverage to extort a local person in order to get their paperwork processed in a faster manner. And of course, as it ties into the quality of the bureaucracy, you also need to think about the level of public sector wages. So in countries where civil servants receive extremely low wages, of course, they may be a little bit more desperate to engage in kinds of corruption. One of my former students years ago said he'd worked for the Customs Department of a Latin American country, and he said that they really didn't get a salary, but instead their supervisors told them they were supposed to confiscate a certain amount of goods per day, crossing between the border, and then after they confiscated that amount, whatever they confiscated after that was theirs to keep, and then they would sell that to supplement their wages. And of course, you hear a lot about foreign countries where the police will shake you down for a bribe or something like that, and again, that's to supplement basically extremely low salaries. Now, on the flip side, countries like the Scandinavian countries, Singapore is also a notorious example, where they pay civil servants extremely high wages. And there's a lot of prestige in that profession. In fact, the wages get so high that the opportunity cost for engaging in some sort of a corrupt action becomes quite high. Are you going to give up a $200,000 a year job for, a $50,000 bribe? That's a very different calculation than someone in a developing country that makes $1,000 a year and gets a $50,000 bribe, right? Not saying that it's not possible, and I'm not saying that the salary guarantees, that corruption won't happen or will happen, but, that's where we get into this whole debate of corruption versus need versus corruption versus greed. And if the salaries are high enough, that can greatly reduce corruption based on need. Now, there are some people who are just greedy, and there's not a lot you can do about somebody's internal character unless you have very, very strong penalty systems that can mitigate that a little bit. But even then, it's not perfect. I mean, in organizations where you have very high, or governments where you have very high penalties for engaging in corrupt acts, it can, again, increase the cost of engaging in corrupt behavior. If you know that you engage in corruption and you just get a little slap on the wrist, okay, I got caught, big deal. That's a very different calculation than knowing that if you're convicted of bribery, that you may go to jail for the rest of your life. So the calculations are different. But again, with the greed piece, it just means that maybe they'll expect way bigger bribes. Okay, I won't engage in corrupt behavior for $50,000 because that's a 10-year prison sentence if I get caught. But for $500,000, I might consider it. Do you see how that calculation is kind of different there? Of course, institutional controls can also mitigate some of this corruption due to greed. When you have regular internal audits, that can help reduce examples of corruption if you know that you're always being watched. Of course, you can also have external audits, but they're not as good. People coming from the outside, it's a little bit harder to spot. I remember when I was in the Army, we did, working in HR, we had regular audits of kind of our subordinate HR units. And there was one idiot. I guess he thought he wasn't going to get caught. He was shredding vacation forms from people. They would go on, they'd submit a form, a leave form, to go on vacation for 2 weeks or take time off from work. And in exchange for money, he was shredding the leave forms. And of course, we caught it because when someone goes on leave, that's also recorded in a different system than just the leave form. There's an administrative side, which would be the leave form, but then there's the tactical side. How many people are available for combat and things like that within a given period. And so we would notice that the leave forms didn't match the tactical personnel accountability. So of course we caught the guy, and I'm sure that everybody thought about, wow, if I'm thinking about doing that, I better not, because I will get caught. So again, that varies by country to country. Again, I mentioned already that rules can be very confusing, particularly with regards to the ideal bureaucracy. And the final kind of indirect factor with corruption is the example of leadership. If you are in an organization where leaders set a good example and don't engage in kinds of corrupt behavior, then you're thinking, well, the boss isn't doing that, so I won't either. But if you have a boss or a president or a political figure that is engaging in corruption, you might feel inclined to engage in corruption too, because, well, after all, look at him. He did that and he didn't get in trouble, so why should I? So a lot of it comes from the examples provided by leadership. So in our next video, we're going to talk just a little bit about the measurement of corruption. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, comment below, I think it's on that side, or subscribe. Looking forward to seeing you next time.